The rain had been falling since evening, turning the narrow streets of San Lázaro, a forgotten Latin American town, into mirrors of trembling light. Old lampposts flickered through the mist, painting halos over puddles. Somewhere, a radio murmured a hymn from the 70s, its static melting into the rain's whisper. Inside a modest house at the edge of town, a single window glowed. Behind its fogged glass, Miriam, 7 years old, was awake. Her mother thought she was asleep, the kind of sleep that protects children from storms. But Miriam's eyes were open, reflecting the soft rhythm of lightning across the ceiling. Her room was simple: a wooden crucifix above the bed, a chipped ceramic angel on the dresser, a Bible her grandmother had left with a pressed flower between Revelation and the Psalms. Water tapped against the glass like fingers waiting for permission to speak. "Maman?" Her voice broke the hush, almost apologetic. But no one answered. Only the wind. Then she said it again, slower, as if the night itself needed to understand. They hid it where no one would look, in the light of the last rain. The words floated, strange and clear, carrying a warmth that didn't belong to the cold room. The small flame of the bedside candle bent, as though bowing, and for a moment the rain outside paused, not in sound, but in meaning. A shiver passed through the walls. Miriam turned her face toward the crucifix, her lips trembling between fear and recognition. "The prophets didn't lie," she whispered. "They just couldn't say everything." The air thickened. The candlelight fluttered like a heartbeat. From the street below came the metallic echo of a bell. 3 short rings, though no church was open that late. Was it thunder, or a calling that only she could hear? She sat up, hair falling over her small shoulders, her gaze distant and unwavering. "When the last light bends," she said softly, "they will remember what they buried under their own tears." Outside, a flash tore the clouds open. The rain returned, heavier, as if the sky itself exhaled. Miriam closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to listen. If you were there, standing by that doorway, would you have believed what your ears could not name? Would you have felt that tremor, the one that isn't fear, but something deeper, something that asks your heart if it still remembers heaven's language? Would you have stayed, or stepped away from the holy silence that was just beginning to breathe? Stay? Sometimes mystery speaks louder than reason. San Lázaro did not make the maps proud. It clung to a hill like a last candle to its wick, a town of corrugated roofs, mango trees leaning over low walls, and laundry lines that wrote the week's story in shirts and sheets. The bus station was a painted rectangle with tired benches. The market smelled of cilantro, diesel, and hope. The church square kept a cracked fountain that sang only when it rained. People greeted one another by name, and even the stray dogs carried a memory of belonging. In a narrow street where the hill makes the houses breathe a little heavier, a small home gathered daylight the way cupped hands gather water. Its entrance had a wooden cross and a nail for keys. The living room held a mismatched sofa, a radio with a stubborn dial, and a print of the Sacred Heart with gold flaking at the corners. The kitchen was a compass of ordinary miracles: rice that stretched, oil that lasted, salt that remembered to be faithful. Here lived Miriam with her mother and father, humble hands attached to hearts that had learned the grammar of gratitude. They prayed as people breathe, without speeches, with a rhythm that did not try to impress the sky. On weekdays, the mother whispered a psalm while hanging clothes. On Saturdays, the father lit a candle for the town and for the ones who had left to chase work in distant cities. On Sundays, they walked to the church together, the bell counting their steps like a patient shepherd. Scripture was not a visitor, it was a neighbor who always had time to sit. Miriam had the quietness of rain before it is noticed. She watched more than she spoke, but when she spoke, the room paid attention the way a field listens to wind. Her eyes were not dramatic, they were patient. She could tell when the old shopkeeper's back hurt by the way he smiled too much. She could hear a storm an hour early by how the birds argued in the mango tree. She liked to sit at the window with a notebook and a pencil, the length of a sparrow, drawing the shapes of clouds and the names of streets as if writing a letter to a friend the town had not met yet. Her parents did not call her gifted. They called her beloved, and that is better. Before the sentence that would turn San Lázaro into a place people whispered about, there were smaller notes in the melody, little slippages where the everyday thinned and something else shone through. Once, at dawn, Miriam followed her father to the market. Vendors shook crates awake. A woman set out lilies in a bucket. A butcher sharpened his knife like someone practicing a prayer. Miriam stopped by a stall of lamps and said, almost to herself, "Oil remembers the ones who wait." The vendor, a gruff man with hands like bark, looked up sharply and then quickly down, as if caught reading his own soul. Another time, the power cut at night, one of those sudden silences that has a sound of its own. Neighbors called across balconies. Someone cursed the utility company. Someone else laughed because the stars had their chance again. The parents searched for matches. Miriam, who was tracing a psalm with her finger, blew gently toward the dark and said, "Light knows the way home." A second later, the radio hiccuped alive on its own. Her mother swore the plug had remained out. Her father said that maybe the line caught a ghost of current. They both smiled uneasily and let the explanation settle like dust, present but not pursued. There were moments in church, too. Father Roberto, thin, old, with eyes the color of river stones, preached with a voice that made children behave out of tenderness, not fear. He spoke of prophets as friends who tell unpleasant truths because they love you too much to lie. Miriam would listen with her head slightly tilted, as if the homily were a painting hung a bit crooked. Once, after Mass, she asked him, "Why does Isaiah sound like a door that won't close while the wind is still speaking?" The priest laughed in surprise, and then did not laugh at all. "Because, Phila," he said carefully, "the Holy One prefers windows to vaults." Life continued as lives do. Wages counted twice. Uniforms washed on Friday night. Mangoes eaten with salt in the shade. The radio announcing rain as if it were news, even though the clouds had already delivered the bulletin. Yet the air around Miriam had begun to carry whispers of a larger weather. She was not dramatic. She did not fall into trances or recite verses in unknown tongues. She shared her bread with a stray cat and pressed dandelions in her grandmother's Bible. But sometimes, when she looked at the horizon where the town's roofs met the sky's blue fatigue, there was a knowledge on her face that did not belong to a calendar. The first situation strangely sacred arrived without trumpet or headline. It was late afternoon. The color of tea left too long in the cup. The mother had a bowl of beans soaking, their skins wrinkling like faithful elders. Miriam stood by the sink, watching the water settle. "If you don't stir it," her mother said, "the salt won't find friends." It was the kind of sentence that turns kitchen work into sacrament. Miriam smiled and took the spoon. As she stirred, a thin filament of oil rose and drew a slow figure on the surface. An oval, then a line, then a small uneven flame. Miriam leaned closer. "Maman," she whispered, "look." The mother came, wiping her hands on a towel. On the water, the oil had arranged itself into something like a tiny lamp, trembling but unbroken. The mother laughed softly. "You see lamps everywhere, mia figlia," and kissed her head. But after Miriam went to her room, the mother stood longer than necessary at the sink, staring at the little shape until it dispersed, as if a gentle finger had smoothed it away. Days later, on the way home from school, Miriam and her father passed the chapel of Our Lady of the Way. A construction crew had left sacks of cement stacked under the eaves. The sky bruised purple. The air tasted of coming rain. Miriam paused before the small stone step, bent down, and traced with her finger the grain of the threshold. "They passed here," she murmured. "Who?" her father asked, adjusting his satchel. "The tired ones," she answered, "who carry names that will be used at the end." He wanted to ask what she meant, but a drop of rain convinced him to hurry. That night he told his wife the sentence, and then shook his head with a smile, the kind men wear when they are afraid of the door behind their laughter. The parents were good people, and good people often negotiate with mystery like polite hosts. They changed nothing in the routine. They corrected homework, paid bills, swapped shifts when a neighbor needed help, and saved a little for shoes. But their prayer grew quieter and wider, as if they were making room at the table for a guest who had not knocked yet. In San Lázaro, rumors travel faster than buses. A boy told a girl that the small Torres child saw lights in water. The girl told an aunt that the child spoke to the priest about windows. The aunt told the woman who sells empanadas that the child knows when the rain wants to confess. None of this felt dangerous. It felt like the town had discovered a new tone in an old song, one you only hear if you stop singing long enough to listen. And you, if you had visited then, before bells rang at odd hours and candles bowed as if acknowledging a passerby, would you have noticed? Or would you have said, "Every town has a quiet child. Every family has a story they tell themselves to keep the roof from feeling heavy"? Or would you have sensed the ridge of holiness under the smooth skin of the day? Sometimes the holy does not arrive like a storm. Sometimes it arrives like a neighbor who always used the back gate and finally decides to knock at the front. Sometimes it is a child who stirs beans and sees a lamp where everyone else sees lunch. Sometimes it is a line of scripture remembered at the sink, or the way a mother touches a wet forehead with an old prayer, or the way a father steps aside so his daughter can look again at what he pretends not to see. "You already know," Miriam told the cat one evening, scratching its ear while the sun surrendered to dusk. "Everyone already knows, but it hurts less to forget." What would you have said to her then? Would you have asked for proof or for patience? Would you have left the conversation with the resolve to be practical, or with the suspicion that practicality sometimes hides fear? You have known children like this, haven't you? The ones whose silence rearranges furniture inside you? The ones who do not need to speak much for the room to change around them? A week before the rain-soaked night when the kettle would tremble in the candle bow, Miriam woke, just before dawn, and stood at the window. The town was a soft shadow. The hill wore a shawl of mist. In the dim glass, her face looked both 7 and ageless. "They didn't hide it in the dark," she said to no one. "They hid it in the way light returns." Her mother, half asleep, heard her and pulled the blanket to her chin, as if the sentence had lowered the temperature of the room and raised its gravity. Thus, the world before the mystery. The same bread, the same streets, the same prayers. And yet, under the day's fabric, a silver thread had been woven, waiting to be noticed, waiting to be pulled gently until the pattern emerged. If you had been there, truly there, would your heart have leaned forward? Would you have recognized the whisper paging you by your oldest name? Or would you have smiled kindly at the child and reminded her that school begins at 8, that beans need salt, that life needs nothing more than what it already has? Do you already know which answer your soul would have chosen? The storm did not end that night. It rearranged itself into gentler weeping, like the sky had remembered something and refused to forget too quickly. Morning came slow to San Lázaro, silver and damp. Raindrops still hung from the laundry line like a rosary forgotten mid-prayer. Inside the house, the air smelled of coffee and damp notebooks. Miriam woke with the quiet dignity of someone who had been listening all night. She didn't burst into revelations. She went about her morning, folding her blanket, touching the wooden crucifix as if it were a friend's shoulder, placing her grandmother's Bible back on the dresser. But when she spoke, a different weather entered the room. "Papa," she said, watching the rain give up its last insistence on the window. They wrote what they could. The rest was placed in bowls. "In bowls?" he repeated, half smiling as he searched for her lunchbox. "Bowls that break if you shout," she answered, then pointed to the round stain on the kitchen table where years of hot cups had left their memory. "Like that." Her mother looked up from the pan, wooden spoon in her hand, and forced a practical tone. "Eat your bread, Philha." Miriam obeyed, but between bites she added softly, "When the prophets hid it, they asked the poor to hold it for them, because the poor remember." No one had taught her to say that. No one had even hinted. The sentence sat on the table like an extra plate. Her father cleared his throat, folded a dish towel that did not need folding, and kissed the top of her head as if to anchor both of them to the ordinary. On the way to school, the town felt newly washed, and yet some corners seemed sharpened as though the edges of things had decided to speak clearly. They passed the small chapel where a bucket caught a leak from the eaves. Miriam stopped to listen to the plinks. 5 quick, then a pause, then 3 slow. "It's counting," she murmured. "Counting what?" her father asked. "Signposts," she said. "Not the big ones. The kind you only see when you walk slowly enough to be late." He laughed softly to normalize the moment, but his eyes flicked toward the chapel door, where a carved angel had its finger at its lips. On the wall, a fading poster announced next month's vigil. He thought of asking Father Roberto to visit. He thought of not making a fuss. He thought of both at once and felt the small ache of a decision postponed. At school, life pretended to continue untouched. Children exchanged stickers, compared eraser smells, drummed pencils like small thunderstorms. The teacher wrote dates and verbs on the board. Miriam did her work with the calm concentration of a child who treats letters like seeds. But during reading time, she stared out the window and whispered, "He hasn't forgotten the taste of dust." "Who?" the teacher asked gently, assuming a story game. "The one who bent to write on the ground," Miriam replied, gaze still on the bright, wet world. "His hand remembers what the earth felt like that day." The teacher went very still. She was not offended, she was pierced. She dismissed the class to recess early and sat for 1 minute longer in an empty room, thinking of a sermon she had heard as a girl and of a prayer she had stopped praying because it was too beautiful to survive disappointment. Then she stood, smoothed her skirt, and told herself she would tell no one. She told 2 people by sunset. When Miriam came home, her mother was peeling plantains and listening to the noontime rosary on the radio. The voice reciting the mysteries had the weary kindness of nurses and bus drivers. Miriam leaned against the counter and watched the peels curl like long, thin pages. "Mum," she asked, "do you remember the night when you almost did not forgive?" The knife paused midair. "Which night?" "The one when you stood by the sink and you said, 'If I open my mouth now, I will break the jar.' So you didn't open your mouth, and the jar didn't break." Her mother set down the knife. The storm outside the house seemed to come inside for a heartbeat, just one drumming, and then it passed. "You were not born yet," she said, voice careful, as if stepping across a fragile bridge. "I know," Miriam answered, no triumph in it, just the grain of fact. "But he remembers the jars, and the jars remember him." Her father returned before sundown with fresh bread and eyes that had measured a long day. He had met 2 old clients, carried a sack of rice for a neighbor, and thought of very little except what he could do next. Yet the minute he crossed the threshold, the house informed him, kindly, seriously, that the day was not over. At supper, after the blessing, Miriam looked at the bread as if making a promise. "When the end comes," she said, "people will try to read the sky." But he wrote the final line on the face of mercy. That's where it is. Not in thunder. In mercy that costs. Her father set the knife down. "Querida," he began, torn between pastoral caution and paternal fear, "why do you say these things?" "Because I remember," she said, frowning the way children frown when they are trying to be exact. "But it isn't my memory. It's like when you wake and the pillow still keeps the shape of your dream." Silence arranged itself among them like an extra chair. Her mother reached for the salt, hand trembling very slightly. She had always believed in God. She had always believed that God speaks. She had even believed on strong days that God speaks to the humble. But what do you do when the humble is your own daughter and the words do not fit into the shelf where you keep your understanding? That night, Rain returned to the town in brief rehearsals, as if practicing for some future performance. In her room, Miriam drew little lamps and bowls in her notebook. She colored the flames with a yellow pencil down to a nub. Then she added small hands, wrinkled hands, calloused hands, clean hands, dirty hands, holding each bowl. "They entrusted it to the hands that had nothing to prove," she whispered. Her mother lingered in the doorway. "Entrusted what, meu amor?" "The part the prophets couldn't speak because the paper would burn," Miriam replied, not looking up. "The part about how the end is not a monster but a door, and the hinge is mercy." Her mother came and sat on the edge of the bed. She gathered Miriam's hair behind her ear with a tenderness that had weathered many storms. "Phila, people say many things about the end times. Some frighten children, some sell books, some help us change." "I'm not frightened," Miriam said. "I'm homesick." Her mother's eyes filled but did not spill. She pressed a kiss to the top of Miriam's head, then stood and turned off the light. In the darkness, the small ceramic angel on the dresser caught a thread of street lamp glow and seemed to nod. In the days that followed, the memories came not as visions, but as phrases, clear, unadorned, and strangely familiar, like a song heard in childhood and remembered by the body before the mind. In the market, he will come to the places that already kept a chair for him. In the bus, watch the ones who share their last coin. They are reading the schedule correctly. In the church, when he said, "watch," he meant love until it hurts, and then keep loving. Sometimes her words were like the edge of Scripture. Sometimes they were the quiet between verses. They did not contradict the Bible. They seemed to stand in the doorway, inviting the family to step from the page into the room where the story breathes. Her father tried to test gently. "And what about the signs? The wars, the rumors, the earthquakes?" Miriam nodded, solemn. "They are true, but everyone can see those. The hidden part is smaller and costs more. A bowl of oil that no one notices, still burning after midnight. A neighbor forgiven before he asks. Bread cut thinner so the plate of another is full. The end is not an alarm. It's a wedding that begins with the poor dressed first." He swallowed, the knife heavy in his hand. He thought of his own grudges. Little stones he had carried for so long he had forgotten they were heavy. He thought of his father, who died during a January storm, and the apology he had never mastered. He thought of whether believing his daughter would require him to become a different man by Friday. "And you, if your child said these things, where would your heart run? Would you gather proof like umbrellas, trying to stay dry beneath a sky that insists on making you new? Or would you let yourself be rained upon, letting familiar certainties wash away until the ground of your soul shows through? Would you believe? Or would you flee the thing you've prayed for your whole life because it finally arrived wearing a child's voice? One evening, a sunset embroidered the edges of dark clouds with molten thread, Father Roberto visited. He had heard, of course. Towns are generous with news, but he came with his hat in his hands, not his finger raised. He sat at their table like someone sitting on holy ground without naming it. "Miriam," he said, after tea and stories and laughter had done their shy work. "Some say you remember things." "I remember love when it costs," she replied simply. "And that's where the hidden line is." "The hidden line?" the priest asked, gentle as an open palm. "The one the prophets buried for us," she said, "so we would have something to find when everything else is loud." He nodded, eyes shining with a sorrow that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with awe. He did not interrogate, did not measure her words against the yardstick of scandal. He only asked, "Does the remembering make you proud?" Miriam shook her head. "It makes me small, like a bowl." After he left, the parents stood by the door longer than necessary, listening to the priest's steps fade down the street. The mother leaned her head against her husband's shoulder. "If this is of God," she whispered, "may we not get in the way? If it is not, may we not pretend we're brave by being suspicious?" He wrapped his arm around her. "I am afraid," he confessed, words he rarely allowed himself. "Not of her, of the changes my believing would require." They went to bed without answers. Rain began again, not a downpour, but a meticulous tapping, like a hand writing on the roof. In the half-sleep that belongs to parents, they each prayed the same prayer in different words. "Teach us to recognize you when you choose small rooms." Meanwhile, Miriam slept. In her dream, there were bowls and lamps and a long table with places set for names the town had forgotten. No trumpet sounded, only a door opening and the smell of bread. She woke before dawn with a sentence in her mouth, a sentence that would not let her go until she gave it away. When the last light bends, it will bend toward the least. She carried it into the kitchen where her parents were already moving through the choreography of mourning. She spoke it, small, clear, faithful, and set it down between the coffee cups like another piece of bread. Her parents did not argue. They did not exult. They stood very still as if the room had become deeper. The father reached for her hand. The mother reached for the other. They closed the circle with their silence and let the sentence breathe. And you, if a sentence like that arrived at your table, would you set an extra plate for it? Would you welcome it like a quiet guest who has no coat but carries good news in her pockets? Or would you walk it to the door, apologize kindly, and say, another time, perhaps, when the bills are paid and the roof fixed and we've learned not to tremble? If your child said this, your child, with your smile and your stubbornness and your reflections in her eyes, would you believe, or would you run from the gentle fire you've begged heaven to send? Sometimes the end of the world is only the end of our explanations. Sometimes prophecy is a kitchen that refuses to be merely a kitchen. Sometimes the hidden line is written not in thunder, but in the way you pass the bread. And sometimes a 7-year-old soaked in last night's rain and tomorrow's light remembers for all of us what the prophets hid, not to tease us, but to train our hearts to find. The mystery did not grow by noise. It grew by weight, like dew that makes each blade of grass heavier with light. In the Torres home, plates still clinked, homework still argued with sleep, bills still blinked on the fridge with their square insistence. But everything wore a finer edge, as though a careful hand had sharpened the day before handing it back. The rain slackened, then returned in brief rehearsals, as if the sky were learning a new language. On certain nights, when the town lay in the blue hush between dogs barking and radio switching off, a draft moved through the house with the timidity of a guest who fears to interrupt. The candle on the dresser bowed, only a little, only once, but both parents saw it. Neither spoke. Miriam spoke less. She carried her sentences as one carries a fragile lamp through a crowded room, close to the chest, steady, humble. When she did speak, her words arrived like small doors in ordinary walls. The hinge is mercy, she had said, and now her silence made the sentence breathe. At dawn, the mother found her kneeling by the window, not in drama, but in a child's posture, thin knees in a thin nightgown, hair falling, hands open on the sill. Outside, San Lázaro wore a sheen of washing. Mountain fog crawled down alleys and filled them with a silence that wasn't empty. Miriam looked at it as one watches a friend approach from a far road. He remembers the poor first, she whispered. Not to the mother, not to the fog, but to whatever it is that receives the truth before it becomes a rule. At the market, people had begun to look at the Torres family with the politeness reserved for those who may be carrying holy things by accident. Vendors lowered their voices. The butcher, who swore at his scales for stealing, now cleaned the blade with an almost liturgical patience. The woman who sold candles added one extra to the mother's bundle and charged nothing, then pretended she had miscounted. No one said they believed, but their hands behaved as if belief were near. Small signs, the kind that do not flatter the skeptic, accumulated like dew. The cat that never allowed touch now waited on the doorstep at exactly the hour Miriam returned from school, rubbing its face on the hem of her skirt, as though assuring some invisible register that the day had survived. The neighbor's geranium, which had refused to bloom through 3 Novembers, turned a stubborn red, then a reckless one. The old clock in the church, famous for never agreeing with itself, began to keep time during Mass, and only by a minute or two, which is all grace ever asks. The parents wrestled in the way faithful parents do, with kindness, with fatigue, with the heavy tenderness of those who would rather carry a mystery than put it down and call it solved. The father grew meticulous in small duties, as if a clean sink could negotiate with heaven. He fixed the back gate, oiled the squeak that had sung for years, tightened the chair that had wobbled under 100 elbows. He said to himself that if the house was in order, he would be equal to the truth when it knocked. The mother's wrestling was quieter, all inside. She set another place at the table most nights without admitting it. An extra spoon, the good cup, a folded cloth napkin that had belonged to her mother. When she realized what she was doing, she laughed at herself, then did it more intentionally. In case, she told no one, he comes hungry. Some evenings, faint bells announced themselves, though the church door was locked, and Father Roberto swore he had wound nothing. Once, 3 short rings, and 1 long, spaced like a breath prayer. Another time, a single clear note at the exact second Miriam's pencil lifted from a page on which she had drawn a bowl with a crack carefully stitched in gold. Kintsugi, the teacher later murmured, not sure how a child in San Lázaro had found an art from a world away. Miriam only shrugged. He likes broken things mended in the open, she said. That way the light knows where to enter and where to stay. The town did not stage a spectacle. It adjusted. The baker started setting aside 2 loaves each dawn for anyone who forgot to hope. The bus driver who cursed at every incline began to stop for a bent-backed man even when he was not at a stop. A teen who swaggered in borrowed arrogance carried groceries home for a widow, then spent a slow hour on her porch speaking of nothing and going nowhere, as if learning the etiquette of mercy. Still, there were contradictions, as there must be in any honest story. A man scoffed, "Children say things," with the precision of a blade that has more to defend than to cut. Another muttered about delusion, his own fear disguised as intelligence. A woman whispered that the devil fancies angel's clothing and that watchfulness means suspicion. The town nodded, as towns do, because dissent keeps the room from being smug. Yet even the dissenters slowed their step when passing the Torah's house. And more than once, one of them, this same intelligent man, that same suspicious woman, paused by the fence and pretended to read her phone while listening for something. Inside the house, the conflict folded itself into ordinary motions. The father scrubbed a pot clean enough to use as a mirror. In it, he saw his face wearing a tiredness he had earned and a tenderness he could not explain. "If I believe," he dared at last, leaning on the counter, "what must I become?" The question did not accuse, it invited. The answer did not arrive, it ripened. The mother began rising before the light to sit in the kitchen with a psalm, a blanket, and silence. She found that her prayers had fewer nouns and more verbs, and that most of the verbs were small. Keep, hold, heal, stay, teach, lift. She no longer asked for proof. She asked for shape, for her heart to learn the shape of whatever God was making with them so she would not resist by accident. Miriam's memories did not expand into elaborate scenes. They sharpened into tasks. "Leave an empty chair by the door," she said one Monday. "He likes to sit before anyone notices." "Save the first cup of coffee," she said Tuesday, pouring it back into the pot. "He drinks after the last." On Wednesday, she stood by the sink and ran a thread of oil into a saucer. "It will not shout," she reminded the house, "but it will burn." And it did. Not dramatically, not with flame that sings hair or eyebrows, but with a steady blue-gold whisper that endured the draft and the door, the laughter and the sighs, until even the father stopped pretending it was a trick of air. He could not say the word miracle without feeling vulgar, as if he had taken a photograph during prayer, but he could not deny that the saucer held a testimony that was not interested in headlines. One afternoon, clouds massed over the hill like a choir clearing its throat. The power failed with the familiar resignation of old wires. The neighborhood emerged onto balconies and thresholds, practicing the ancient art of being together without topic. In the quiet, a child began to sing a hymn learned from an aunt. Another child responded with a verse out of order. Their chaos delighted the evening. Miriam stepped out with her parents and sat on the step. She did not lead a song. She watched the light where it gathered, in faces, in cupped hands, in the slow kindness of people making room. A neighbor, Mariella, who had always been practical and brave, brought over a bowl of beans and half a papaya. "For later," she said, though it was already later. She hesitated, then asked in a voice she did not recognize as her own, "Does the little one still say things?" "Mostly she is quiet," the mother answered, and both women felt the sentence settle in the space like a bird that knows where to land. Mariella nodded. She looked at Miriam. "Do you remember anything about me?" Miriam considered. "Not performing, not fishing. I remember," she said finally, "that on the day you were humiliated by those who should have loved you, you held the jar." Mariella paled. She had told no one. "You kept your mouth closed and your hands open," Miriam continued softly. "The jar did not break. He will use that later when everything is loud." Mariella covered her face with both palms, not to hide, but to steady. She exhaled the long exhale of someone unafraid to be seen loving the one who had never stopped seeing her. Then she laughed, wiped her cheeks, and said, "I brought too much papaya." Everyone understood that too much means enough for a miracle. News of such sentences traveled as news does in towns that still share salt, fast, with cha-cha rhythm and prayer at the end. Men folded them into jokes they told badly. Women tucked them into aprons, where they keep small money and large secrets. Youth pretended disinterest, and then stood on corners longer than usual, as if waiting for a timing that was not theirs to schedule. Father Roberto visited often. He brought nothing with him but the peace of someone who has learned to stand still. He did not test Miriam with doctrine. He let her words meet scripture like rain meeting a river that already knows its ocean. When he prayed in the house, he prayed as if he were stepping into a garden others had planted, careful where he put his feet. One evening, after tea, he told the parents, "If this is of God, it will make you kinder, poorer in spirit, more generous with time. If this is not, it will make you frightened, proud, easily offended." The father stared at his hands. The mother whispered, "Teach us to choose our poverty well." The first unmistakable public sign came not with flame or voice, but with bread. The baker had counted wrong. Everyone could see it. He had planned for 30 loaves. 37 emerged, full and burnished, singing their quiet song as only bread can sing. He blustered. New yeast, what can I say? But his wife, who had measured flour since the wedding year, shook her head. New yeast does not count to 37, she said, and crossed herself with flour-dusted fingers. Only later did people remember that Miriam had walked by the bakery at dawn, pause, place her palm against the cool window, and whisper, He keeps his promises in ovens, too. The second sign was smaller and therefore larger. An argument broke out near the bus stop. Two brothers whose father's will had left more questions than coins. The town prepared to enjoy the spectacle, human nature lined up like chairs. Before the voices could sharpen enough to wound, Miriam passed with her mother. She did not stop. She did not even look. But her small hand pressed the small cross she wore, and she said a sentence that blew through the scene like weather. He is closest where we pay the bill for love. The older brother dropped his hands. The younger pulled his chin into his chest and swallowed. They agreed, no lawyers, half now, half in patience, and went home by different streets to practice not hating. No one credited a child. No one denied what everyone felt, a pressure let go, a storm called off by a wind nobody commanded. And yet, inside the home, the mysterious weight ran ahead of the town's whispers and waited in the hallway with their coats. The father woke one night, convinced he had heard his name spoken, in the tone his mother used when he was 5 and had scraped his knee. Not scolding, not indulgent, tender, and not to be resisted. He lay awake and let the tears wet the pillow without shame. If I believe, he told the ceiling, I must forgive my brother. The ceiling did not answer. It glowed with the moon's indifference and God's patience. The next morning the father called. He did not use the word forgive. He asked about the children and the job and how the roof survived the storm. The brother cried anyway, quietly, as men cry when a long war ends without a treaty, only a door left open. The mother's inward battle resolved itself in a single brave and unremarkable act. She took the good tablecloth from the bottom drawer, the one for holidays and photographs, and spread it for an ordinary Tuesday supper. For whom? The father asked, half smile, half fear. For the one who doesn't mind crumbs, she replied, and set the extra cup with a steadiness that humbled him more than any sermon. And Miriam, what did the growth of the mystery do in her? It made her smaller, the way a lamp is smaller than the dark it undoes. She laughed more. She asked to help with dishes more. She spent longer with people who had nothing to teach and much to give. In the evenings, she traced with a finger the map of San Lázaro on the fogged window and touched certain streets with the authority of blessing. There, mercy will be needed, she would say. There, someone will notice the hinge. She did not assign roles. She did not appoint prophets. She simply named the places where love would be costly and therefore beautiful. How many times does the divine pass among us, and we misname it weather, coincidence, a good day, a better bread, a kinder brother? How many times do we demand fireworks and miss the quiet hinge turning? When we finally notice, and there will come a day when we do, will we be ready to pay the price, that coin called mercy, the only currency legal in the kingdom's market? If the end has indeed been hidden in the light, not the dark, are our eyes practiced for such brightness? Or do we prefer the safety of shadows where we can still curate the story? When the mystery grows, not as spectacle but as weight, do we bow under it? Or do we straighten our backs and pretend there is nothing on our shoulders but the day? What would you do if a child's silence rearranged the furniture of your soul? Would you forgive the brother, set the extra cup, hold the jar when anger begs you to break it? Would you let the light bend you toward the least? Or would you insist, kinder than cynicism, harsher than truth, that the world must stay as it is because your heart has not yet learned to grow? And if he came hungry tonight, would there be bread? And if he sat by the door before anyone noticed, would someone notice? And if the last light has already begun to bend, very softly, very surely, do you want to be standing where it falls? He came on a Thursday because Thursdays in San Lázaro were gentle. The market had already argued with the dawn and made peace. The buses coughed themselves awake and accepted their lot. The clouds practiced a slow choreography over the hill, promising rain without threatening it. Father Roberto walked with his hat in his hands, not for sun, but as one enters a friend's home unarmed. He had baptized babies, buried grandparents, married the brave and the terrified. He had learned to recognize the smell of holiness, the way farmers learn the smell of rain. It is not perfume. It is not incense. It is the scent of something true opening. He paused at the Torres gate. The wood had been recently oiled. It did not complain when he pushed it. Inside, the small courtyard held 3 potted plants, a broom, a child's chalk drawings, bowls, lamps, a door with a hinge drawn in gold. He breathed, then knocked. The mother opened, smoothing her hair without knowing she did. The father stood up from the table too quickly and smiled the smile of men who would rather be plaster than be seen. "Padre," they said together, as if rehearsed. He answered by placing one hand on each of their shoulders, the old blessing of someone who knows that words should arrive last. They sat. Tea found cups. Weather found a sentence. The priest asked about work, about the aunt with the bad knee, about the neighbor who owed everyone a little and no one too much. He asked these things because love asks them, and because he was not there for the spectacle people thought he might be there for. Then a small wind, no, not wind, only the intimacy that comes when people decide to stop staging themselves for one another, passed through the room and left it larger. "Miriam," the mother called softly. The child appeared in the doorway, socks uneven, hair behaving like a field. She did not perform joy, did not perform shyness. She came as children come when the guest is already loved by the room. The priest stood out of respect, an old habit he had when holiness arrived small, and then remembered to sit so she would not have to climb a mountain of courtesy. "You are Father Roberto," she said, not quite a question. "I am," he answered. "And you are Miriam, who draws doors with hinges." She looked at him, surprised into a smile. "He likes the hinge." "He does," the priest agreed, as if they were sharing the same sacred joke. He did not test her. He did not ask her to repeat phrases that had already made their pilgrimage through the town. Instead, he asked if she might show him where she sits when she listens. Miriam nodded and led them to the small room where a crucifix watched the bed with a kindness that made sleep a prayer. The candle on the dresser had not been lit. Still, its wick wore the color of work. The Bible lay open, where a pressed flower rested between wild apocalypse and ancient song. "Here," she said, and climbed onto the bed with the problem-free competence of a 7-year-old in her own world. She knelt, no drama, no theater, and rested her hands on the windowsill. A slow, thin rain had begun, so light the drops sounded like a rumor of water. "May I pray?" Father Roberto asked the room more than the child. "Please," the mother answered, and the father's amen sighed from some place deeper than his lungs. The priest did not raise his voice. He let each word carry its own weight and none other. He thanked the Lord for air, for breath in that air, for the floor that holds without complaint, for the bread that chooses not to leave us, for the mercy that does not ask for a better applicant. He asked quietly with the trust of someone not auditioning, for protection of the little, for courage for the grown, for purity of intention for himself. Then he did a dangerous thing in front of people who needed courage. He allowed silence to answer. He had learned over decades that silence is not the absence of God. It is the form God chooses when we are too noisy to recognize another. The silence came. It stayed. It did not impress. It did the work. In that silence, Miriam spoke, not to interrupt, but the way a brook speaks when prayer kneels beside it. He hid it in the light because light bends, she said, and it bends where it finds a poor heart. The prophets didn't hide to keep us ignorant. They hid so that searching would make us kinder. The priest closed his eyes, not to be pious, but to keep the ground from tilting under his feet. He remembered all his sermons about watchfulness, half of which had been noble and half of which had been afraid. He remembered the years he had defended the church like a castle and the later years when he had learned to love her like a wounded body. He opened his eyes and saw the hinge and the gold chalk on the concrete floor. "Child," he said, careful to keep his voice a bridge and not a verdict, "how do you know these things?" "I don't," she answered, honest as rain. "But when I am small, I remember." "Do you see things?" he asked. "Sometimes I see where mercy will be expensive," she replied. "Sometimes I see a bowl. Mostly I hear quiet telling me to wait." He nodded. "Quiet has raised me well," he said. Then, because he was a pastor and because his call was to guard without suffocating, he added, "If words come to you that make you proud or make you think you are the center, close the window. If words come to you that make you love people you would rather avoid, open the door." Miriam smiled as if this instruction had arrived long ago and simply found him saying it aloud. "He always stands by the door," she said, "before anyone notices." He felt the prick of tears and let them stand without falling. There are moments when authority is best exercised by weeping. He did not want to frighten the parents. He did not want to exalt what should remain human. He wanted to ask every question, a net full of cautionary fish, but he had learned to prefer one question. Will this make us more merciful? He decided to test her memory against mercy. "What have you remembered for me?" he asked, an old man risking the nakedness of need in front of a child. She took her time. The rain wrote a line, paused, wrote another. "You have asked hard questions alone," she said at last. "You think the end will be loud enough to make people behave because you are tired, but the hidden line says the end will be quiet enough to make people choose. You will need to choose too. Forgive the man who wanted your post and lied. Invite him to drink coffee. Don't explain. Ask about his mother." The priest's mouth opened, then closed, the way doors do in a storm. That betrayal had kept him company at night, like a wolf at the edge of a field. He had domesticated it with theology and busy schedules. He had never offered it coffee. He bowed his head and did an unremarkable thing that sounded like a gospel. He said, "Yes." The mother exhaled as though she had been holding the room on her shoulders. The father looked as men look when they have seen something incorruptible and wish to belong to it. They were not relieved exactly. They were enlisted. "Will there be signs?" the father asked, finding his courage. "The kind that keep our families safe when others panic?" Miriam considered. "There will be signs anyone can measure," she said. "Storms, wars, shaking. But the hidden part will be this: kitchens that refuse to panic, tables where the extra cup is never empty, hands that hold jars when anger wants to break them. The ones who are safe will be the ones who are trusted with mercy." "Trusted with mercy," the mother repeated, as if learning a foreign word that tasted like bread. The priest watched the way the sentence took root in them, quietly, as seeds prefer. He knew his task. He must keep them small, not by shame, but by wonder. He must keep the town from mistaking a child for a circus and a house for a shrine that charges tickets. He must teach his people how to walk on holy ground without building a fence. "May I bless the room?" he asked. "Please," the mother said again, this time with a steadiness that suggested she had decided to stop apologizing for God's nearness. He stood and raised his right hand, fingers tracing an old sign that had outlived empires. "Lord," he prayed, "you who hide in light and bend it toward the least, keep this room little. Let words here be simple and true. Make pride allergic to this doorway. Let mercy be expensive and gladly paid. Teach us to prefer the hinge to the trumpet, the bold to the platform, the poor to the spectacular. And when you come hungry, find bread. When you come late, find the lamp still burning. When you come unannounced, find us already welcoming." As he blessed, a small thing happened that only small eyes notice. The flame in the unlit candle leaned as if greeting a wind that had arrived without moving air. The priest did not point to it. He did not need to. Everyone had seen. They returned to the table. The father cut bread in thinner slices than custom. The mother set the good cup again, not apologizing. The priest took the second slice, the worst piece by appearance, and thanked God aloud for dryness that makes us ask for oil. He asked if he might come again on Tuesdays to sit and not investigate, to be a witness rather than a policeman. They said yes, with the kind of yes that does not reserve the right to be busy later. When he left, the rain had committed to itself. Lamps on the street smeared their halos across wet stone. He walked slowly, the way you walk after you have been handed something that will break if you rush. At the corner, the boy who mocked everything out of fear nodded at him without mockery. The priest nodded back as if witnessing a sunrise. At his rectory, he placed a second cup on his small table and poured half a coffee into it. He looked at the chair. He did not imagine a figure. He did not conjure a voice. He simply placed his betrayal at the tablecloth's edge and asked the Lord to teach his hands the weight of cups that are not for show. He wrote a single line in his notebook, quiet enough to choose. Then he closed it and slept without bargaining. In the Torah's house, silence settled not as absence, but as furniture, useful, friendly, sure. Miriam slept too, fingers still stained with yellow chalk where she had drawn a hinge on the porch. The parents whispered one last ordinary courage to each other in the dark. "Tomorrow we will be kind. Tomorrow we will set the extra cup. Tomorrow we will not ask what it proves." And you, if invited to such a room, if asked to stand in the doorway where a child kneels and a priest listens, would you have the courage to look into this child's eyes and let them name the thing you still refuse to forgive? Or would you lower your gaze, afraid of what holiness might ask of you, and look away before the light has time to bend? The first thing to change in San Lázaro was the air, not its smell, though some swore they sensed a sweetness like mango blossom on days when no tree was in bloom, but its weight. The air carried something that reminded the soul of memory, as if the town itself had started to remember the reason it was built. People walked slower, not out of fatigue, but as if trying to hear the rhythm beneath their own footsteps. No one announced a miracle. There were no posters, no gatherings, no photographs. Yet the whisper of something sacred crossed from one house to another the way the scent of bread travels through a neighborhood, without permission, without pride. In the bakery, bread continued to rise beyond arithmetic. Each morning there was more than logic allowed, and every evening there was less hunger than math could explain. The baker stopped counting. He started thanking. One dawn, as he placed the loaves on the counter, he murmured, "He keeps his promises in ovens too," repeating words he had not learned from himself. He glanced toward the hill, toward the Torah's house, and for the first time in years crossed himself not out of fear, but out of recognition. The bus driver, Antonio, who once swore louder than his engine, began to hum hymns while driving. At first, he pretended it was for rhythm, to keep from dozing on long routes. But when he saw how the passengers leaned their heads against the windows with a peace that did not belong to traffic, he stopped pretending. On Thursdays, when Miriam walked past the bus stop, He turned down the volume of his radio and tipped his hat, not as a gesture of reverence, but of gratitude, like one thanks a flame for reminding darkness of its limits. In the market, words softened. Vendors no longer shouted as if each mango were a competition. They began to call each other by name. One woman returned a coin she had kept from a miscount months ago. "It was heavy in my apron," she said. The other replied, "I had already forgiven you before I knew." They laughed, both embarrassed by how light their laughter felt. People began to speak more quietly, as though reverence had joined the conversation. And yet, nothing official had happened. The church was not fuller. The priest had not changed his sermons. It was the invisible economy that shifted. Grudges began to lose interest. Patience gained value. Father Roberto noticed it in confession. People came not to justify, but to release. A woman confessed envy and left her gold ring on the table for the parish poor box. A man who had once avoided Mass because of pride came to light a candle, not asking for healing, but to thank God for the illness that had made him kinder. The priest did not record numbers. He listened to silences growing fertile. He visited the Torres home often, keeping his promise to sit and not investigate. Sometimes he found Miriam drawing circles that became bowls, lamps, faces. Sometimes she was reading her grandmother's Bible aloud to the cat. Sometimes she was only listening, her ear tilted, her lips parted in a half smile, as if hearing a hymn too delicate for air. He never stayed long. He knew holiness prefers short visits and long echoes. At school, something changed in tone. Children began to defend one another more. Bullies forgot their schedule. The teacher, once brisk and efficient, now paused before correcting, as if searching for gentler grammar. One afternoon, when a student wept because of a lost book, Miriam walked to her and placed a single word like balm: "Found." Hours later, a janitor brought the book from the rain gutter, dry, intact, marked only by a faint smell of candles. The miracle was not the finding. It was that no one called it a miracle. They simply nodded and continued, as if grace had finally learned to pass unnoticed among them. Rain returned at its leisure, soft and faithful. When it did, people opened windows instead of closing them. They said the sound comforted their houses. Even those who had once been cynical began to feel something near their ribs when they crossed paths with Miriam, a tremor too kind to be fear, too deep to be mere admiration. They described it differently: a calm, a pulse, a strange lightness. Father Roberto called it recognition. One evening, the square filled for reasons no one could name. A few children played, the old men shared a bench, a group of women peeled fruit and traded memories. Miriam was there too, holding her mother's hand. The church bell struck 8, though it was only 7:40. No one corrected it. The echo lingered longer than it should, then faded into a silence that tasted like salt. In that space, a wind lifted skirts and papers and the edge of the priest's stole. Someone began to hum a hymn, the one about lamps that stay lit for the bridegroom, and others joined, without plan, without key, without embarrassment. Voices cracked and blended. The air shimmered as though the song had weight. When the last note died, Miriam whispered, "He is listening." No one answered. No one had to. The faces in the square looked like prayer before the mouth finds words. After that night, San Lázaro changed again, not outwardly, but in the way a wound heals, from the inside, slowly, beautifully. The mechanic returned tools he had borrowed and forgotten. A shopkeeper closed on Sundays for the first time in 30 years. The widow down the street stopped talking to her dead husband's photograph and began to talk to God again. At the clinic, 2 nurses who hadn't spoken in months worked side by side without a word, and something clean passed between them, like forgiveness wearing a white coat. And there were tears, gentle, unprovoked tears. In kitchens and buses and the market stalls, people would pause mid-sentence, overcome by something unnamed that moved through the town like invisible rain. It wasn't sadness. It was recognition. Hearts, remembering that they were made to carry something holy and that somehow they had started again. Father Roberto began to notice light behaving strangely, not bright, not theatrical, but aware. In the church, candles burned slower when people prayed softly, faster when they argued with God. The flame above the altar tilted toward the front door at dusk, as though bowing to the street. "He's out there," the priest said once to himself. "He always was." Miriam's parents watched the town with quiet wonder. They were still humble, still paying bills, still worried about next month's repairs. Yet their fear had turned into attention. They no longer asked, "Why us?" They asked, "How do we keep this honest?" They cleaned their table as one tends an altar. They spoke to neighbors with the gentleness one uses when holding something breakable and beloved. The child did not seek admiration. She fled from it. When someone tried to call her blessed, she shook her head and said, "We all are. Some of us just remember sooner." She played marbles, fed cats, learned multiplication. And yet, everywhere she went, things seemed to breathe easier after her passing. One farmer swore his crops grew greener along the path she had walked. A teacher said her classroom smelled faintly of rain when Miriam entered, and yet it was not her. It was the one she carried in her small, unknowing obedience, the way a lamp carries fire without claiming the sunrise. The more the mystery touched San Lázaro, the less the town spoke of it. The sacred does not need applause, it needs shelter. People began to guard their tenderness instead of their suspicions. They stopped gossiping about the Torah's girl and started visiting one another more often. They shared recipes, confessions, laughter. The laughter was holy because it came after forgiveness. Once, during a storm, lightning struck the hill and split a tree near the church. The town gasped. The next morning, Miriam went to the site and touched the trunk. She said, "It's not punishment, it's opening." The priest came later and saw that inside the scarred wood, the grain formed a faint spiral, like a fingerprint too large to belong to any human hand. And you? Has your heart ever recognized something before your mind could explain it? Have you ever entered a room and felt peace sitting there, waiting for you like a person who knows your name? Have you ever forgiven someone and found your lungs suddenly full, as though mercy were air? Perhaps you have already known what San Lázaro came to learn, that the divine is not a visitor but a host, and we have been guests too long without noticing. The touch on the community was not a miracle to be published. It was the rediscovery of what had never left, the heartbeat under the noise, the mercy under the routine, the kingdom that had been here all along disguised as kindness. So the people of San Lázaro stopped waiting for thunder. They began to light lamps instead, each home a hinge of mercy, each heart a bowl of oil, each word a door slowly opening. And you, if your town began to tremble like this, not in fear but in love, would you have recognized it? Would you have joined the song that no one started? Would your heart have bowed before it knew why? Or would you have closed the window, afraid of rain that does not destroy, only remembers? The church had always been small. Tonight it felt smaller, by which everyone meant nearer, as if walls had leaned in to listen. Outside, the rain threaded the town with silver patience. Inside, wax breathed its gentle sweetness, and 100 small flames rehearsed the courage of light. The altar cloth was simple linen, the chalice like a quiet star cupped in metal. The old stone floor shone where countless souls had polished it with need. Father Roberto moved in the dim like someone translating for the night, hands sure, voice unhurried, presence without hurry or threat. They had not announced a vigil. They had only left the church door open, and the town interpreted the invitation rightly. People arrived as families do to a kitchen at dusk, without speeches. The bus driver hummed himself into a pew. The baker carried 2 loaves wrapped in a towel, unsure why he had done it, but unwilling to come empty-handed. The nurse who had forgiven quietly slipped into the back and wept softly, not for sorrow, but for room made in a narrow heart. Children behaved without being told to, as if their bodies remembered that play and prayer are cousins. Miriam sat with her parents in the 3rd pew, left side near the pillar that sometimes dripped in heavy rains. She wore a plain dress and carried nothing but her listening. She did not glow, she did not tremble. She looked like a child being small on purpose, which is a seldom-seen holiness. Her father's hands were clean and restless, and her mother's lips moved in a psalm without sound. The priest stepped to the ambo and did not preach. He lifted a Bible and kissed it, as if greeting an elder. Then he said the only sentence that fit the night. "Let us be very quiet." Silence arrived. It did not push. It took up its chair among them and asked nothing. Outside, the rain wrote its careful script on tile and leaf. Inside, breath slowed until it matched some older rhythm that the town had once known and lost, and now found by accident. The candles spoke their small language of patience. Somewhere, a baby cooed and was not shushed because even innocence knows how to fit inside worship. After a long while, minutes or hours, the clock forgot. Father Roberto intoned a psalm. They answered, not in performance, but in hunger. The words, ancient, human, weathered by deserts and kings and kitchens, found their way into throats that had shouted and gossiped and bitten and kissed. A low tide of mercy filled the nave. The priest read from the prophets without commentary, and the names arrived like friends from far roads. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Joel, men who had wept professionally and refused to quit. Then the gospel. Lamps lit, doors ready, the bridegroom walking the ordinary streets where poor folks keep their chairs near the threshold. When the readings ended, the priest did not fill the space with explanation. He sat, he took off his glasses, laid them on the pew, and let his eyes be useless for a while. The town borrowed his courage and leaned further into the quiet. Someone coughed. Someone's knee clicked. A candle flared and then composed itself. In the side chapel, the statue of Our Lady seemed a little more made of yes. Then the old bell, which had not behaved in years, rang itself once, soft as a fingertip on porcelain. Heads lifted. No one gasped. They only looked the way people look when a guest arrives early, and they are relieved to be found not yet ready, because readiness often ruins welcome. The priest stood. "If anyone has a word born of love," he said, "let it be small enough to fit through the eye of a needle." A long time passed, during which no one tried to be impressive. Finally, a widow with hands like rivers said, "I've hated the rain since he died. Tonight it sounds like him coming home." Ah! The town received her sentence like bread broken, and something in the air said, "Amen," without sound. A boy confessed he had stolen apples. The baker offered him the job of counting loaves. They both laughed, and the laughter did not disturb the holy. It illuminated it. A woman admitted she could not forgive her sister yet, but she had washed the extra cup. The priest nodded. That is already forgiveness learning to walk. And then, because the night had been preparing for this, and because mercy always arranges its own timing, Miriam stood. She did not look around to measure the room's permission. She turned toward the crucifix, her chin slightly lifted as when you are listening for your name in a crowd. The church, which had felt small, now felt infinitely gentle. A manger expanded to hold a town. She spoke with the voice of a 7-year-old who has been allowed to remain a child in a world that often insists on counterfeit wisdom. "They asked me to remember something for you," she said, and they included prophets and fishermen and mothers and a carpenter who had learned poverty the way most learn language, by being immersed in it. They said the hidden part is not a code, it's a cost. They hid it so that only the ones who love would find it. No one moved. The candles leaned slightly as if a breeze had passed. She continued, simple as seed. "When the end comes, you will try to read the sky. It's natural. It has colors and sounds, and the world loves noise. But the last line is written where light bends toward the least. Look for the door where mercy hurts. That's where he will pass." She paused, not to impress, but to let the words take off their shoes. The priest's knees found the kneeler. The baker put his face in his towel. A teen lowered his mask of indifference and let the night see his 13-year-old eyes again. Miriam lifted her hand as if feeling for rain inside the sanctuary. "Do not be afraid of the end," she said with kindness that had weight. "Be afraid of forgetting. The end is a wedding. The poor get dressed first. The lamp that stays lit is the one that kept burning when nobody looked. Keep it burning." Her mother cried then, not in panic, but in recognition of a task she had already begun. Her father swallowed hard and counted the debts he would finally pay with visits and apologies and bread. Father Roberto's tears arrived without theatricality, like honest guests. He whispered the line he had written in his notebook days before and now received again from a child, quiet enough to choose. The church did not erupt. It deepened. People began to move as if gravity had increased. Slower, truer, nearer the floor where God prefers to meet the human race. Confessions rose not from guilt performances, but from relief. Two brothers who had fought at the bus stop walked toward each other as though pulled by a tide. A girl returned a necklace she had secretly kept. The owner placed it back in her hand and said, "Keep it. Consider me forgiven." She shook her head and set it at the foot of the altar, where metal learned a new purpose. At the back, an old man who had sworn he would never kneel again found himself on his knees without remembering how he got there. Beside him, a skeptic who had promised to watch critically watched instead, like a son afraid to miss his father's arriving step. The air thinned with holiness until the lungs learned to breathe it. Someone began the hymn about lamps again, off-key, unashamed. Others joined, and the harmony corrected the melody as love often does. Halfway through the hymn, the power failed. Darkness came like a curtain that had been waiting to fall. No one screamed. The candles kept their covenant. The rain pressed its palms against the windows as if blessing the room. In the dark, a voice, Miriam's, spoke one last sentence, the kind that no one could forget because it carried the shape of heaven's grammar. "When the last light bends, let it find you near the least." Silence did not break. It blossomed. People stood or knelt or wept or laughed softly. Some placed money at the poor box, not to solve poverty, but to learn generosity. Others moved down the pews to sit beside those they would rather avoid, an obedience that cost them more than coins. A young mother offered her seat to a grandmother whose back had been a faithful cross. The grandmother refused, then accepted, and their hands found each other in the compromise mercy loves. The priest raised the monstrance, but even this was quiet. He did not frame the moment with speeches. He walked with the host as one carries a sleeping child, steadily, humbly aware that the task is to not wake the one who is already waking the world. He paused at each aisle, and people did not reach for spectacle. They reached for surrender. The old bell rang itself again, a single tone like a consent. Rain softened into mist. Somewhere beyond the nave, in houses with leaking roofs and in rooms where loneliness had paid rent for years, something shifted. People who had closed their windows opened them. A man who had hated the smell of his own past found it had become less rancid, perhaps because he had set an extra cup. A woman who had promised to never return to church found herself whispering thanks to the darkened ceiling of her room. When the lights returned, no one cheered. They blinked and smiled and kept the mood as if guarding a newborn from noise. Father Roberto placed the host upon the altar, head low. He murmured a prayer that had no flourishes. "Keep us small, Lord. Keep us kind. Keep lamps lit where no one looks. Miriam sat again. She looked like any child who has done the one thing asked of her and is glad to become ordinary once more. Her father squeezed her hand, a promise to become a different man before sunrise. Her mother kissed her hair, a vow to keep setting the extra cup until the habit was indistinguishable from love. The vigil dissolved into tasks, collecting wax, dripped foil, closing windows, adjusting the door that stuck in damp weather. People left without analysis. On the steps, neighbors greeted one another like the forgiven greet the forgiven. The air felt thin and clean, as if the town had climbed a hill and was learning the lungs it had been given at birth. The baker approached the priest. 37 again, he said, and they both smiled at a number that had become parable. Antonio, the bus driver, promised to stop cursing the steep road and to learn a hymn in a key that did not frighten children. The skeptic shook the priest's hand and said nothing. The priest answered with the kind of nod that translates to, "I know." When the last families drifted into the night, the church remained with its little lights and its wet threshold. Father Roberto extinguished candles slowly, whispering thanks for each, as if each wick were a person. The final flame bowed, thin and willing. He stood alone and heard the rain become a blessing. He turned to the empty pew where the poor sit when they come, and he saw, not vision, not apparition, only memory practiced into presence, that the seat was not empty at all. Outside, San Lázaro shimmered, and the rain performed its old mercy on dust. Windows glowed like held tongues of fire. In one, a table with an extra cup. In another, a lamp refusing to admit it was tired. In another, a child sleeping with a small smile the world could not explain. And you, at the hush where the sacred is more felt than seen, would you have heard it? In the quiet that costs, in the mercy that hurts, in the lamp that burns without applause? Would you have listened, or would fear have shouted louder inside you, demanding a thunder God had already replaced with a door? In the silence of the sacred, would you hear, or would fear speak louder? Morning returned to San Lázaro as if it, too, had kept vigil. The rain receded into the hills, leaving the streets rinsed and honest. Laundry lines trembled with a shy breeze. Dogs stretched into the light as though remembering a dream they had been guarding all night. Nothing in the town looked different enough to photograph, and yet everyone knew the furniture of the days had been moved one palm's width closer to heaven. Miriam woke as children wake after a long celebration, hungry, cheerful, ordinary. She folded her blanket, washed her face, pressed her lips to the wooden crucifix in a kiss so light it could have been a breath. Her mother called from the kitchen. The smell of toast and panella rose like a promise. Her father whistled an old tune off-key and did not apologize. They ate. They spoke of groceries and homework and a neighbor's new roof that still leaked in one corner. The lamp on the dresser, yesterday's small witness, rested unlit but not retired, the wick stained with the memory of fire. On the street, the world rehearsed its trades. The baker slid loaves into the morning like warm punctuation. The bus exhaled its first passengers with the usual reluctance. Vendors arranged fruit as if color could heal. But speech had changed. People said, "please," as though borrowing breath from one another, and giving it back improved. They said, "forgive me" for small things and meant it for larger ones. They said, "I was wrong," without making themselves victims or martyrs. No trumpet sounded, and yet humility walked the cobbles with the relaxed step of one finally at home. Father Roberto chose to keep the church door open all day, not to receive a flood, but to give the town a place where the quiet could sit without being mistaken for absence. He moved through small duties with sacramental care, straightening hymnals, trimming wicks, wiping wax from wood until the grain shone like a yes. He wrote no proclamation. He made coffee and poured 2 cups, and when no one came, he drank one and set the other by the pour box because love learns to wait. The gifts of the night did not become a legend. They became habits. A woman who had feared rain without her husband now left her window ajar when showers murmured, letting the sound cross her room like a prayer with a familiar voice. 2 brothers who had nearly torn their father's memory into legal strips began to sit together on Thursdays, eating oranges in silence, practicing the grammar of peace. The teenager who had kept indifference like armor discovered the relief of running barefoot in the square with smaller children, letting laughter argue with cynicism until cynicism gave up. As for Miriam, no crown grew around her head. No crowd followed her. She packed her school bag, fed the cat, and asked if she might carry the spare umbrella to the elderly woman 2 doors down. On the way, she traced her finger along the walls, brick, paint, a scar where someone had patched a wound with haste and hope. She hummed nothing anyone recognized, and everything everyone needed. When people greeted her, she smiled with the freedom of one who had never met applause. At school, the children returned to multiplication tables and maps of countries that seemed less far away now that love had taught them distance is not measured in kilometers, but in kindness. The teacher noticed how the room listened to itself. In that listening, she dared to assign a new kind of homework. Bring me a story of mercy you saw with your own eyes. By week's end, her desk had become an altar of scraps and sentences, bus tickets with apologies written on the back, drawings of lamps above kitchen tables, a note that read, "I did not hit back." She graded none of it. She blessed all of it. There were still quarrels. Food still ran short near the end of the month. A man still swore at a pothole and frightened his own heart. Not every apology landed softly. Not every wound consented to close in the first season. Peace did not remove weather. It taught them to walk with it. And when discouragement came pretending to be sophistication, the town remembered to light something small, a candle, a stove, a smile that cost a little courage. The light bent as Miriam had said it would, and the bending showed them the next step, if not the road. One afternoon, Miriam and her mother returned from the market with bread and lemons. The sky was trimmed with thin clouds like lace. The hill wore its green without bragging. They passed the spot where lightning had split the tree. From the wound, new leaves had erupted, a tender, reckless green that refused the narrative of finality. Miriam stopped and rested her palm on the bark. "He loves to grow things from what we call endings," she said, quiet as moss. Her mother nodded and swallowed a gratitude that had begun to feel like oxygen. News of the vigil traveled and tired itself out, as news does. It became a story told at kitchens and doorsteps, each version missing details and finding truer ones. Some said the bell rang twice, others that it had been a single note long enough to become a thread. All agreed on this. They had been given a sentence to carry. When the last light bends, let it find you near the least, and carrying it had already changed the shape of their days. The priest visited the man who had slandered him. He did not rehearse arguments. He did not assemble evidence. He brought coffee and asked about the man's mother. A door opened that had rusted shut. It did not swing wide. That would have been dishonest. And yet it moved. And the squeal of its first inch sounded like an alleluia whose voice had cracked at puberty and never quite recovered, which is to say, it sounded real. The mechanic returned a tool left accidentally on purpose in his shop. The nurse wrote a letter to a woman she had avoided in the clinic corridors and handed it to her without explanation near the candy aisle at the corner store. A boy gave back the apples he had once stolen and paid for them with money saved from counting loaves. The baker insisted the new job paid in bread, and the boy insisted it paid in dignity. They agreed that both were necessary. As for the church, it grew no larger, but the town's heart no longer felt too big for it. Vigil turned to cleaning days, to shared soups, to kneeling that did not break backs because it had been learned as a way of standing. The monstrance shone no brighter. It simply found more faces ready to be still. The holy played no tricks. It became a household word, like wash, like wait, like welcome. And each time they said it, something in them remembered Eden. The seasons turned. Mangoes came and forgot to be stingy. Winds arrived and left like travelers with good manners. The cat bore kittens beneath the Torah's bed. Miriam named them after psalms and prophets, and one after her grandmother, who had taught the Bible to hold flowers. Father Roberto watched a line of first communicants approach the altar with the patient frenzy of spring. He saw in their faces a future that would not flatter him or obey him, but might, by grace, outlove him. On a late afternoon of exhausted sun, Miriam sat on the step, drawing hinges in the dust. Her father returned from town slower than his legs could explain. He carried no burdens. He carried choices made. He sat beside her and said, "I visited my brother." She looked up, and the world fit inside her smile. They did not speak of results. They spoke of the taste of the coffee and the color of the wall and the way the light had bent across the table toward two stubborn men until it found the least in each and made a road there. Night returned to San Lázaro with the tenderness of someone who has learned not to knock too loudly. Lamps lit windows like verses. The air cooled and did not withdraw its kindness. In the Torah's home, the extra cup had ceased to be a symbol and become ceramic with a history of lips. Sometimes it remained untouched. That was not failure. That was fidelity. They said it because setting it had taught their hands the truth about who owns the table. Before sleep, Miriam opened her grandmother's Bible to the thin page where Apocalypse and Psalm had become friends. The pressed flower had lost its color and kept its shape. She read a line and let it read her. Then she closed the book and listened, not for thunder, not for visions, but for the same quiet that had taught the town to choose. It came. It always came when called by mercy. And you? How many things does God whisper into the world each day while we are checking the sky for alarms? How often does eternity lean into our kitchens and buses and clinics and squares, asking not for spectacle, but for a chair, for a cup, for a lamp willing to burn unpraised? Have you felt it? The small ache of recognition, the gentle pressure to forgive, the peculiar relief that follows obedience when no one is watching? Would you dare to believe that the secret the prophets hid was never the riddle for heroes, but a road for the humble? That the end we fear is a beginning that prefers back doors and poor hearts? That the last light has always been bending and will continue to bend until the least among us is no longer alone? San Lázaro learned to answer those questions with acts small enough for children to carry. Perhaps that is why the town felt young again, not naive, not spared of grief, but fluent in hope. Peace did not replace labor, it sanctified it. Silence did not mock speech, it tuned it. Eternity did not excuse the day, it entered it and stayed. When Miriam finally slept, she dreamed nothing she could report. The dream's work had already been done in the hours when her feet touched the floor and her hands touched bread, and her voice touched the hinge between heaven and here. The rain, somewhere beyond the hills, practiced its return. The tree, once split, wore new leaves that did not apologize for being green. The church, with its open door and its honest floor, held the night as a mother holds a child who has cried and needs nothing now but closeness. Quantas coisas Deus sussurra ao mundo? E quantas nós realmente escutamos? Maybe the number is not the problem. Maybe the question is whether we have placed the extra cup, whether our lamps have learned to burn without applause, whether our hearts have agreed to be poor enough for light to bend toward them. In the end, which is to say, in the beginning we keep postponing, the last line waits in the face of mercy. It has always waited there. It will wait until we turn and read it aloud with our lives. And so the story quiets, not because it is over, but because it has finally learned its volume. The town sleeps, the lamp breathes, the door remains on its hinge, ready. And the child, now very simply a child again, dreams inside a house that has remembered why it was built, to welcome love when love arrives hungry and at odd hours. Let the light bend. We will be found near the least.